Okay, so let's get started. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's session. It's going to be another great one, a great book. I hope many of you had a chance to read at least parts of it, if not all of it. It's funny, it's very interesting. We're going to learn a lot. I just want to mention a couple of quick things. I'm going to skip the bio piece in the interest of time, and almost everybody knows Mark pretty well by now. I want to mention again that this series and all of our literary series and programs are made possible with the generosity of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley, who was a regular attendee at all these kinds of things. We're going to use the Q&A button for you to send me comments or questions at the prompting of Mark, and I will relay them to him. And I just want to mention to everybody, those of you who have a particular poetry interest, we're having a four-part series led by our friend Judson Scruden. That starts in 2 weeks in person at the library, Thursday morning at 10:30, September 28th. We'll be doing 4 weeks on the poetry of Jory Graham, who is a very fine contemporary poet and had a brand new book that came out earlier this year. We're going to be going over a lot of her poems from that book. With that, turning it over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everyone. I want to hit some high points, I hope, from last time to make it clear what Utopia and now Gulliver's Travels will do. I'm using them to set the table for this series. So I made the point that the Republic was not really a utopian text. It is a ancient text about the philosophical discussion in a dialogue about what makes a just state and the recognition that justice is something that has to be worked at. It's not a literary text, although some people teach it that way. It's beyond my competence to do that. And then we turned last time to Utopia 1516, and I pointed out that if Thomas More, as a humanist, as an administrator, intellectual scholar, actually wanted to propose an ideal state on Earth, he could have found an easier way to do it. He was a Catholic and a humanist, by which I mean he was concerned in the nature of humanity, and he believed in the corruption of human beings and that their salvation could not come on this planet, this earthly life. He was also part of a movement in the Renaissance where the question wasn't what is a just state, but how do you empower and educate monarchs and their advisors to govern people who are flawed and weak? It was an issue that, in the absence of two of the mainstays of the centuries before, the feudal system, which put everybody literally in an ordered place, was very hierarchical, and the the Roman Catholic Church. And in the absence of those two things, many Protestant and Christian humanists started talking about how do you govern. It's interesting to think that those utopias, or that utopia, that particular one, the challenge is that people are deeply flawed. And you will find in the course of this course, if you haven't learned that already, that utopias are more powerful as individual people's wishes or dreams of what a place would be. They don't work very well as an actual plan. And so we will see that this work tonight, which has some utopian elements, uh, is filled with problems of being over rational, too deeply involved in science, too ignorant of perspective, and so on. Swift was a satirist. The Encyclopedia Britannica considers him the greatest satirist writing in English. I promised you last time that I would explain, as I will later in this hour, why the 18th century gravitated to satire and the 19th century to tragedy. But most utopian ideals very quickly corrupt themselves into dystopias, whether it's Lord of the Flies or The Handmaid's Tale or Cloud Cuckoo Land. And so even Erewhon, a 19th century, a Victorian vision, anagram of nowhere of a utopian society, turns out to be a satire. And what's implicitly being satirized when you write a utopia that is not an ideal state is not just the example you're giving, but the ideal of utopias. Turns out they don't work very well because of us. So Swift was an Anglican minister. He was an Anglican minister in Ireland, in a overwhelmingly Irish country. He, I think it's fair to say, was despised the Roman Catholic Church for being anti-intelligent, for being um, punishing in terms of uh, money that they gathered, of being anti-England, using the Irish uh, desire for their own country as a kind of shield. And you see Catholics get very bad treatment in Gulliver's Travels. Um, Ambassadors to Japan throw crucifixes on the ground and walk on them to ingratiate themselves to their non-Christian hosts. And there's a lot of animus in Swift's life. So the ancients um, came up with two main um, kinds of satire. There are more, but the two main are the Horatian and the Juvenalian, Juvenian, after Horace and Juvenal. And the Horace is the gentle, mocking, loving, easygoing criticism, and the Juvenalian is the scathing, deriding kind of criticism. And so you see that in Gulliver's Travels, we see issues of both, the making the people of the island 1/12 the size of Gulliver and most humans, I think of as a sort of gentle satire, even though some of the things he mocks are pretty extreme. Later in the Four Voyages, when he comes up with an island where the thinkers are so lost to reality they have to be slapped in the face, or so theoretical that they lose any sense of reality, uh, he's being more darker and more Juvenalian. Um, Satire was the great form of literature in the 18th century because this is the Enlightenment. The uh, people of Europe in the 18th century, especially in England, France, and Germany, felt that the study of mankind is what men and women should be involved in. They'd say men, but and that reason was the greatest gift. And people like Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, and others believed this strongly. Swift was dubious because he thought that the period put too much stress on reason. But the argument of some of these rationalists were that if you consider the universe as a kind of great watch, well constructed and a beautiful design, you would have to know with certainty, not faith, but with reason, that there was a watchmaker. And this is the argument by design. The universe works so well, you have to know, reason will tell you there's a maker behind it. And because he's a perfect maker, he doesn't have to come periodically and make repairs. And so there's no expectation that there will be miracles because they don't, God doesn't need to make adjustments to the product. He makes this perfect thing, it runs well, he goes away. And they interpreted things like the catastrophic earthquake in Lisbon and other things. Well, this is the normal course of God's plan. We also suffer, but that's not the dominant one. And so, because they believed that reason established order, Alexander Pope said in his essay on man that order is heaven's first law. The first law of heaven is order. And so we have to keep our place. And this is an attempt to provide a substitute for the great chain of being, for feudal hierarchy, for the dominance of the Catholic Church, which is now complicated by no longer being the Church of English people and by being ruled by an outsider, a European. Um, when the Romantics came along at the turn of the 19th century, 18th century into the 19th, they made a counter argument, which is if the world is indeed beautiful, but what if its beauty and design is nothing like a watch and more like a tree? What if the design of the universe is organic and not mechanical? Then it's not a matter of a perfect maker making this thing and leaving it by the roadside for us to know somebody made this. Maybe it's more like a child or a person or a community or a feeling and needs to be nurtured all the time and maybe needs to be nurtured by a loving God. And so the Romantics came up with a view of nature, as I call it, not just STEM nature, but the complications of human emotions and feelings. And no romantic worthy of the name would say that order is heaven's first law. Most would say that love or compassion or humanity or community is heaven's first law. So, because there's so much frustration in the 19th century, where the dream of community, where the joy of connecting to nature is constantly disappointed, because that's the nature of human desire, we're thwarted. The 19th century gravitated towards tragedy. It is a remarkable fact that three of the great thinkers in the Victorian age, Freud and Marx and Darwin, all have the term the struggle for existence in their writings. What the 19th century discovered, this is where we're going next time, but it's relevant to tonight, is that you can only get ahead through opposition. Hegel, who was an 18th century philosopher in Germany with a massive influence on the 19th century and beyond, said you have an idea, he called it a thesis, you generates its opposition or a different version, which he called the antithesis, the antithesis. They battle it out and it creates a new idea, which he called the synthesis. The suggestion there is that there's no progress without this struggle, without this conflict. And if you accept that, as many 19th century thinkers and intellectuals and writers did, then you're consigned to a world of struggle, recognizing that progress is not just a matter of evolution, it has to be fought for. Even Darwin's evolution was characterized by Tennyson, the eminent Victorian, as nature read in tooth and claw, that species get removed or demoted through violence of one group of animals against another. In Great Expectations, I don't know if I gave this example last time, I don't think I did. When Pip meets up again with Estella, whose name means star, she has treated him cruelly because she was bred to do that by Miss Havisham. She says she suffered and she now has a heart that can understand what his art used to be. And she explains that she came to this new understanding because suffering bent and battered her into a better shape. She went through a bad marriage with a abuser and so on. And one of the women in my class, when I was teaching this at Trinity College, who probably was close to the age I am now, said, "Why is it in Dickens that people have to be bent and broken into a better shape? Why can't they be nudged? Why can't they be massaged into a better shape?" And it's because Dickens is a Victorian and he's a Protestant. He believes that suffering in the vale of tears is one of the ways we progress. And in the novel, he was apprenticed early on to Joe Gargery, who's a blacksmith, who, of course, bends and breaks things into a better shape. So it's a given in many 19th century novels, not the early novels, the comedies of Jane Austen, that suffering is part of human existence. And even in the novels by Dickens that end well, like David Copperfield or A Christmas Carol, you have to go through a lot of suffering until you get there. By contrast, the 18th century believes there is a standard of how people should think and behave. It is accessible to everyone who has reason, and yet we do not adhere to it. And so satire requires three things: an acceptance of a standard, a recognition that we're not meeting it, and some means to point out to us the gap between the standard and how we're failing. And that can be gentle and comic, or it can be scathing. But the 18th century embraced the idea of satire because they embraced the idea that order was heaven's first law and that human beings could do better. Things like the skits on Saturday Night Live or the impressions of political figures, that's not satire. That's just parody or burlesque or making fun. Uh, Saturday Night Live in general does not have a agenda for what they want to see the world to be like. The 18th century writers had an agenda. They wanted to make the world better. And that's what Swift is operating from. He can be comic in Gulliver's Travels, he can be scathing. He defended the book by saying he loves individuals, even though he's not so happy with mankind. And I want to point out that this is another book where travel literature, as in Utopia, is invoked. In fact, not only was travel literature very sought after, um, almost always fictional, but not always, in the 18th century, but a mere 7 years before uh, Gulliver's Travels was published, Daniel Defoe published what many people think of as the first novel in English, Robinson Crusoe, in 1719, the first novel. Most people agree that Gulliver is not a novel, it's a prose satire. Gulliver does not have enough individuality, he does not have enough interior life. The point he makes about correcting mankind are too broad to be of as novelistic. But Robinson Crusoe is a novel about a fictional voyage. And people were hungry for such things, and Gulliver's Travels feeds that kind of fad, if you will, by writing not a book that extols the ingenuity of a man by himself and the need for community. And Robinson Crusoe is a celebration of the ability of individual people. Instead, it's a broad and sometimes scathing satire of humanity. It is remarkable that some of it is so charming and funny that many people only know Gulliver's Travels through the first two books, and many people only know it as a children's story or an animated story. And it's always been true that uh, fair minded adaptations of the novel have almost always lost out in terms of popularity to some spin of it, but it's captured the imagination. So I'm going to pause there since we're about a third of the way through the hour and hope that I know some of you have written to me already about your experience with the novel. As always, I prefer to answer comments or inquiries that come before my talk, after my talk, for what I hope are obvious reasons. But I'll turn to Michael now to say if you want to pass on any questions or comments about this. With Gulliver's Travels, we move from talking around a book, as I did with Utopia, to talking through the books. We'll be talking about Erewhon and The Handmaid's Tale and King Lear and so on in the way that we've talked about American novels in the past, not like we talked around Utopia. So, Michael?
Okay, folks, you know the drill. I've got the Q&A box open, and feel free to pop in questions or comments, and I'll pass them on. I thought, in the meantime, I'll just mention that I thought in rereading the fourth book about the Wyndhams, that I thought his almost most scathing But also hilarious satire was when he went on about the lawyers.
Uh, a frequent target in literature.
Yeah,
You may remember that Shakespeare has a line, first we'll kill all the lawyers.
yeah.
Yeah. And even lawyers like to tell anti lawyer jokes. So while we wait, I'll remind you that what I said about Utopia is that Thomas More, like Swift, although not a satirist like him, Thomas More, a humanist, a Catholic, when Catholicism was going to go the way of all flesh in England, um, he would never put forth a rational plan for a perfect society. His good place is no place. And the substitution that's made at the end of the story is the hospitality he shows to Raphael Hippolyte, a purveyor of nonsense, by taking him in, letting him rest, letting him have food and drink, and saying, I'll wait till he's in a better frame of mind because there's much I disagree with him about. And that idea of making a community of kindness, which is the opposite of hierarchy, the work of Utopia, the work of the Renaissance intellectuals who were trying to educate courtiers and kings, was all about power, hierarchy, and governance. These people over these people. More's example of his own Christian kindness, of charity, the greatest of these is charity, has nothing to do with hierarchy, has nothing to do with power or governance. It has to do with equity and fairness and a kind of empathy. And I'm going to give an example of that from Gulliver's Travels after I find out. Are there any comments,
I
Michael?
got a couple. I got a couple right now.
Okay.
Ross is asking, does the idea of utopia provide us with a coping mechanism to survive reality?
Well, I hope you mean that question for everybody in the room as a kind of uh, thought process, because that's not a literary question technically. I would say that it's a comfort to imagine such a place if you don't also realize you can never get there. You'll see in Cloud Cuckoo Land that someone has an opportunity for entering a utopia and decides to pass. So I think the idea of utopia, when people talk about a dream, we can mean a dream that's not necessarily a good thing, something we've been burdened by dreams, but we can also say it's always been my dream to go to Italy. I have a dream job, and uh, the essence of a dream is that it's not real. The comfort is that you can experience it as a wanting. Um, Emily Dickinson, who's writing around the time of Erewhon, where we're going next week, she believed that wanting was the best closest you could get to heaven. That where other people are going to heaven, finally, she's going to heaven all along by experiencing the distance between what she wants and her not having it. She made her deprivation a positive good and experienced the wanting as something that comforted her. She has a poem where she imagines herself outside a window where bread and wine are being offered on a table. You get the image. And she goes in. That poem begins, I had been hungry all the years. And she's invited in to what just seems to be a house or a tavern. And she finds that when she's inside, she no longer has any desire for food or drink. And she understands that hunger is a way that a feeling that entering takes away. It's only valuable in the wanting, in the not having. And once you have it, it's disappointing. And so, like Proust having the character taste the Magdalene and find out it was better when he longed for it than when he had it, the idea that Emily Dickinson, a 19th century figure, believed that actually believing in immortality would shrink her appreciation of this life. She avoided romantic connections in marriage because implicitly she thought that connecting to another would shrink her very fragile selfhood. And although she made a few exceptions, fewer than 10, she wrote 2,000 poems that she never sought to have published because I think she thought that literary fame would also dwarf her. She felt she was a fragile person, and so she needed to be protected from things like utopias. But the people who want utopias are not fragile people. They may be needy, but they actually have the audacity, the courage, the faith, fill in the blank, to imagine not just a better place, but a perfect place. And to people like Swift and Thomas More, that's where they go wrong. So here's an interest. Oh, was there another person you said?
Actually, if you want to take them all, I've got three that are on deck.
Sure, I got nowhere to go.
Okay. So the first one from Patricia says, any further thoughts about why the scale differences, meaning first the little people and then the very big people, is so fascinating?
Well, I'll say to the person who's asking the question, if you found it fascinating, you can answer that question probably as well as I can. Um, in the sense of appealing to people as entertainment, you want to go to a place where things are radically different. He could have made people who look like fish. He could have made human beings who walk on their hands a much more straightforward way. And this again is connected to optics, even though someone I fear either I misspoke or I was misunderstood last time. I wasn't suggesting that the microscope and telescope were only invented shortly before Gulliver's Travels. It was a good deal earlier. But the 18th century, especially in popular culture, is dominated by the idea of optics. If physics is the science of the 20th century, optics is the science of the 18th century. And of course, if you're trying to educate people to look at the world differently, what better argument about point of view than scale? And the scales are exactly proportionate. The small people are 1/12 the size of human beings. The large people are 12 times the size. And from the point of view of children, and there is an element of Alice in Wonderland, right? This character, ship's surgeon, winding up in a strange land where things are not so different. People look like people, and yet they are radically different. Um, we realize that Alice in Wonderland has an appeal because little people are little, and they see people as giants, and parents and adults can pick them up. Think about if you were picked up at the age of 15, how dislocating that would be. So it's an easy and gentle entree into the satire to talk about people who are not just petty, but really small, and not just talk about people who are oafish, but really big. And you see that by the third book, it's not only more complicated, but instead of visiting one main place, he visits like 90. I mean, the whole array of science and belief in the afterlife. So I do think that uh, it's a special category of Gulliver's Travels, not just to imagine an ideal place which comes at the end, Wyndham Society, but to play with the notion of point of view. In every instance, Swift is mocking human beings for their pride in thinking that what they believe is the key to the world. And like Moore, he's a humanist, he's a Christian. We are failed people. We are not going to rationalize our way to perfection.
Got it. So Joanna was asking, she says, I'm thinking about the 19th century, thinking ahead to the 19th century. Would you say that Frankenstein is a tragedy or is it a satire or can it be both?
Well, it could be both, but in my view, it's a tragedy through and through. It is one of the world's great novels. I regret that I've had to twist the arm of my book groups to read it, and then they've liked it. I think too many people avoid it because they think it's a horror story or a science fiction story. It's a great example, 1818, of the romantic sensibility in a novel. One of the things I said earlier is the sense of belonging, of human community, of kindness, care for children. the 19th century, I think I mentioned, discovered children. Um, Victor creates his creature in a couple of sentences. There's no electricity, there's no mumbo jumbo, there's no cathode. One night he just gets it right and the creature exists. But he's horrific looking and misshapen, and Victor runs away and lies down in his bed because he cannot love the thing he made. And Victor's problem, from Shelley, Mary Shelley's point of view, and from her cohort of the romantic thinkers and writers of the period, first decades of the 19th century, is not that he overstepped the bounds of nature by creating life. It's that he failed to keep up to his responsibility to love the thing he made. And the monster, the creature, in Frankenstein, the name, of course, is the scientist, reads Paradise Lost when he is abandoned by his maker. He learns English. He reads Paradise Lost, which is more than I can say for most of us. And he is amazed that God, even with people who violated his law, does not abandon them, throws them out of Eden, but does not abandon them. And he feels deeply aggrieved by Victor, who, from Mary Shelley's point of view, is a bad parent. And Frankenstein's creature suffers from the fact that in an era where maturation to adulthood, where childhood, Tiny Tim, Heidi, Little Lord Fauntleroy, David Copperfield, Pip in Great Expectations, where nurturing a child is a obsession, the creature has no childhood. The creature has no parenting. The creature has no upping. He is a boy, a creature without a childhood. At the end of the century, Dracula, the other great 19th century, um, he can't die. The Frankenstein's creature was never born. Bram Stoker's creature can't die. That's a topic for another day, but it's an interesting parallelism. I'll take another.
Okay, so Celia is asking, does this theme of kindness and civility pervade Gulliver's Travels, Utopia, and the essence of many of the novels we've covered in several courses you've taught?
Yeah, I'm going to give you an example tonight in Gulliver's Travels. I will say that I think in most novels, not just that I've taught, but in most novels that are not extreme tragedies or horror stories, the nature of literary realism is to try to find kindness in the community as it exists in the novel. I mean, part of what the novel does, the novel as an art form, is it tries to take everyday people and show how they can reach some sort of satisfaction. The hidden booga booga, as I say, the hidden flaw in Utopia is that the same thing in human beings that makes us want to have it is why we can't get to it. We long for utopia because we don't like that things get mucked up all the time. And it gets mucked up by people like you and me who muck things up because that's what we do. And the same thing that animates our desire for perfection, is what gets in our way. So I'm going to give the example from Gulliver's Travels. Perhaps you noticed it. So when he leaves the Winhams, and remember, Swift coined the term Yahoo, and it's significant that Yahoo has caught on and Winham has not, even if you say the spelling was against it. Um, in the fourth voyage in chapter 11, he winds up on the ship of a Portuguese captain who is named Pedro de Mendez. And Gulliver says he was a very kind and generous person. The first thing he says after that, in the long paragraph about Pedro de Mendez, again, Voyage 4, Chapter 11, is he desired to know what I would eat or drink. He says the same offer that Thomas More makes. I want to assure you, I don't think Swift was reading a Utopia and modeling. They're not. This is not a descendant of that. It's a cognate. They're coming from the same place. And he says of Pedro de Mendez that he was a wise man. and he spoke so many obliging things. That is, he was a wonderful host, saving a man at sea. That is kindness of strangers. And the more remarkable thing is like the story of the Good Samaritan. The essence of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that fellow Jews left the injured man on the roadside, but a member of a tribe that would not have been expected to help him helps the fallen man, leaves money for him to be taken care of. The moral of the Good Samaritan is not the kindness of a stranger, it's the kindness of a possible enemy. Well, the Portuguese and the English were partners in treaties, not so the Irish. But Portuguese people are Catholic, deeply Catholic in the 18th century. And I've already said something about how Swift is on record in the novel, in the story rather, about his feelings against Catholics. And yet he has one of the final episodes before Gulliver gets home and shows his dementia in hanging out with his horses and not liking the odor of human beings. Um, by having a Catholic European do kindness to himself, to Gulliver. Um, I want to say that's very compelling to me that in addition to mocking anywhere where people try to get perfection, Swift is saying, like Moore, it's right here. You just have to be kind. You just have to step up. And it sounds like a simple thing. Uh, it is, but people blinded by the bells and whistles in Gulliver's Travels. It's a fascinating book. It's a witty book. It's an inventive book, which is part of what Swift is doing. He's having fun. He wants to make money. He wants to be seen as a satirist. But the thing that he doesn't satirize is the kindness of strangers. At the beginning of King Lear, which we're reading, and we'll talk about this when we get to it, in addition to the first act being concerned with who will take over the kingship now that Lear very atypically not only wants to step down because he's too old, he feels he wants to divide his kingdom in three among his daughters. He has two of them married. This day that Act One, there's going to be a suitor marrying his daughter Cordelia. And first, they have to play a game, Who Loves Me Best? Because Lear, in a very unkingly way, needs to have his ego fed in an asinine way. I don't mean the kings don't have ego. And he treats his daughters as performers. And as you know, this is not a spoiler, it's the first act of the play. One of the daughters says, I love you like crazy, Dad. Nobody ever loved you like me. And Lear says, very good. You're going to get this third over here. And he shows them on a map. And then the second daughter comes up and says, oh, I love you even more than her. I love you so much. I love you more than my husband. And did I mention I love you? And Lear says, very good. And you're going to have this third of my kingdom over here. Some productions have a map like a big carpet on the ground. And he walks around it and points. And then he turns to Cordelia, who is his favorite. The name means little heart, Cordelia, and says to Cordelia, okay, you're up. And she says, I love you appropriately. What did why do my sisters get husbands if they not going to love them more than you? I love you just the right amount. And that's because she's most like him. And he says, you sure you don't want to add anything? And depending on how you direct the play, that can be cajoling or that can already be that he's irate. And she says, no. And he says to her, have you nothing to add? And she says, nothing, one word, which could be seen as this gesture to nothing. And he says, nothing will come of nothing. There's a whole motif of nothing in the play. And again, he might say that in a coaxing way, nothing can come of nothing. I'm giving you a third chance. Or he may already be angry and she adds nothing and he is furious. He curses her womb, he exiles her. when Kent says, "King, you're being uh, bad," he exiles Kent. The whole play erupts in this notion that Cordelia did not play the game right. So now, when he's exiled her and she's not going to get any money from him, there's a matter of her suitor, and one is the Duke of Burgundy, and one is the King of France. Very common for um, uh, prestigious people from other countries. And the Duke of Burgundy says, "What's this I hear that she doesn't have any dowry anymore? What happened?" And Cordelia says to her father, "Please explain why you have disowned me. I don't want these men to think that I did anything corrupt or licentious." And Lear explains, "She should have pleased me better." And the Duke of Burgundy says, "Well, that's good to know, but I've got bills to pay, and you did promise me a certain amount of money, and this is conventional." And Lear says, "You'll get nothing from me." And the Duke of Burgundy says, "I'm sorry, I'm no longer interested," and backs out. And the King of France steps up and says, "Is the only thing wrong with her is that she didn't please you?" And Lear says, "That's right." He says, "I'll marry her." And Lear says, king to king, she has no doubt, she has no money from me. And one of the greatest lines, I'm telling you seriously, in all of Shakespeare is when the King of France says in Act One, "She is herself a dowry." That's the notion of valuing human beings as a good in this world. It is a magnificent line in a magnificent play, and more remarkable because it's said by a French monarch. Englishmen and women, but mainly men, in the audience watching this play would expect the King of France to be a villain, uh, uh, to do what Burgundy did and say, "I need money. You're breaking a promise." Instead, he acts kingly when Lear does not. That's a long way around, but we'll come back to King Lear. But these works that bother with giving an alternative, the alternative is charity. The alternative is a human community that's not based on hierarchy. It's a hard thing to manage.
Do
Any
you
other
want it?
comments or
Do you want
questions?
any more questions, or do you want to keep
I
rolling?
do. I'm hoping that for all the books from here on in, that we have as much discussion as possible because they're novels. And although Gulliver's Travels is not quite a novel, within, Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe, and then the years immediately after, we have Tristram Shandy and Moll Flanders and Joseph Andrews and a lot of the great 18th century comic novels that succeed after the prose satire. So yes, I'll take comments and questions.
So here's another one, and it's from Erin. Did Swift believe that the world was becoming a better place, as it seems like people in the early 1900s, before World War One anyway, did? For example, would a country like that of the Houyhnhnms come about naturally?
So Swift would not have been an adherent to anything happening naturally. He did believe that humanity could improve, but he didn't think it could happen through the fetishism of science, especially because he saw 18th century science as turning its back on God. Newton was a religious person, but had his faith sorely tested because the more he studied the mechanics of the universe, the more he thought this can take care of itself, and was coming around more and more to the view that there doesn't need to be any watchmaker doing this. I think Swift felt that the humanist tradition of classical education and moderation in all things, and logic and grammar and rhetoric and the art, that education was best suffused in his case by Christianity, but he would not have insisted that Christianity was for everyone. He would have insisted that a humanitarian, a humanistic rather, a humanistic view of the world was what mattered, and he would have been perfectly respectful of people who followed a life of kindness without any reference to divinity. And sure enough, in the 19th century, people come along, including George Eliot, who create what came to be called the religion of humanity. And the argument there was that the essence of Christianity, a work by a German philosopher that she translated, still now, if you go to a library and get a regular copy of The Essence of Christianity, it will be the copy translated by George Eliot. The man who wrote that book, Feuerbach, said that the essence of Christianity was that until God became a human being, he couldn't help us. The essence of Christianity is the incarnation. Most Christians would say that's it. That's right. That's the big deal. Even more than rising from the dead is being made incarnate in human flesh and becoming one of us. And Feuerbach says, why should that be necessary? It makes it seem as if God is not condescending to become human, but ascending to become human. And Feuerbach's argument was that the incarnation of Christ was a myth because we didn't have the courage to acknowledge our own divinity, and that any good that human beings could evince that we would call grace comes from inside. Emerson, who was a correspondent with George Eliot and a transcendentalist, says in one of his notebooks that happiness will come when youth, young people, learn that above and within are the same place. And he was very close. He had to be careful not to be too loosey goosey, but he was very close to saying, we don't need God if we're willing to acknowledge that we are divine or capable of divinity. Swift would have been an adherent of that, not for himself, but would have, I think, allowed that for other people. And of course, he writes a book that is hugely entertaining, knowing that it will have more longevity than if he wrote a sermon or a screed or an essay in his own voice. People loved reading about voyages.
So Kelly is asking, was Gulliver's insanity caused by the Houyhnhnms' perfection?
No, it's caused by his own irrationality, his own worship of rationality. He loses his mind because he becomes infatuated with mind. That's the problem, and because it's a little bit of Stockholm syndrome. He's now been captured in a place where people who look like him are animals. And so he wants to dissociate himself from his Yahoo-ness. He's not a Yahoo, he's a human being. He's a human being with reason, doesn't make him a Houyhnhnm, but it doesn't make him a Yahoo either. And he's lost the mean, the Aristotelian mean of saying this and that. That's the mix of these things. And the perfection that he seeks is an extreme one, wants to be all reason. And of course, Swift makes the reasonable animals horses who can't thread needles and have difficulty carrying trays and would be, in the view of a rational person, remarkable creatures, but hardly perfect. So he disowns his own humanity because he's identified himself as a Yahoo. He's not a Yahoo, he's a human being, but he gives up the middle ground. Paul Klee, the poet and painter, created a parable, very short, in which he imagined that at the beginning of life, there were two mountains with a valley in between, and that the gods placed um, uh, that the maker, I guess, the creator of the universe, placed the gods on top of one mountain and placed the animals across the valley on top of the other mountain. And in the valley between, placed human beings. And the gods were on the mountain because they knew all, and they knew that they knew all, and so they were content. And the animals are on the other mountaintop because they know nothing, but they don't know that they know nothing, and so they're content. But human beings are on the middle ground where they don't know everything and they're intensely aware that they don't know it. And so they're always anguished. Um, that problem of the people in the middle ground is they haven't embraced the notion of being between two extremities. Well, yes, they know some things, they don't know everything. And yes, they're aware of their own lack of knowledge, but what's wrong with that? If they would embrace the middle ground, they'd be fine. For Gulliver, the middle ground is where he started from, a human being capable of reason, but also capable of being animalistic. I mentioned on our very first meeting, it's a week ago, sorry, that the entire enterprise of ancient Greek literature is to try to get human beings to locate themselves between the impossible divinity of the gods and the reprehensible bestiality of monsters and um, descendental creatures. And to see that humanity is a fine place to be if you can embrace the mean. Turns out Goldilocks had it all right. Not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Straight line from Aristotle to Goldilocks.
Well, yes, I want to say that for all the bells and whistles in something like Gulliver's Travels, which I very much enjoy, the essence of it is the inventiveness of the author is meant to show us what we wouldn't see without that kind of extremity, audacity, and inventiveness. Um, More works by a different means. But the essence of the gift of the knowledge is um, be empathetic, be sympathetic, be kind. And I want to make it clear this is not because of my own philosophical or religious makeup. That this is in the novels. Um, I think I told you that it's now about 20 years ago that a pair of social psychologists did a study of people who were frequent readers of what they called literary fiction. They're not being snobbish. They mean fiction that has people, characters in it that seem like people. So, not genre novels, romance novels, war stories, spy stories, westerns, where the people seem like props. People in most of the novels we read who seem to have an interior life. Basically, every novel that I've lectured on so far at Wilton is an example of literary fiction. And they found that the people who were frequent readers of that were more empathetic and understanding to other people in their real lives. Of course, they didn't just ask them that, they did double blind studies. And that people who were not frequent readers of literary fiction were not, they weren't exercising that muscle. And their point was, and I believe this even before I read this study, is that when you read a lot of fiction that introduces you to the interior lives of other people, you learn to be more understanding. Even if you're very gregarious, even if you come from a big family and you go to lots of places with lots of people, you can never access their interior lives, a few of them that you're close to, but you could never access the interior lives the way you can if you read Anna Karenina or Holden Caulfield or on and on and on. What literature lets you do is experience people from the inside out. And their argument, and they claim they have data to support it, is that by knowing it in fiction, you become better able to actually practice it in reality. I believe that. I think that's actually true. I think reading fiction doesn't just make you more educated, it makes you more humane.
That actually fits in pretty directly with one of Harold Bloom's comments that one of the reasons to read literary fiction is because it lets you meet and get to know so many more people than you otherwise could.
Right. And the old thing that, wherever you go, there you are. Fiction is a great invitation to step outside the bars of selfhood. I don't think I ever gave it at Wilton, but I wrote some years ago a lecture that I've given in some libraries called Literature and Life. That is sort of Mark Schenker on um, literature, maybe someday. But I just want to underscore again that I hope you see Pedro de Mendez comes at the end and is not me reading into it, offering food and drink. He's a wise man. He's a kind man. That you saw that at the end of Utopia. I compare it to the way a Shakespeare sonnet is constructed. A typical Shakespeare sonnet of 14 lines has 12 lines of the problem. Uh, when a disgrace and fortunes in men's eye, I'm really unhappy. Did I mention I'm miserable? I don't know what I'm going to do. 12 lines of that, and then the couplet indented. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. It's not reasonable, it's not rationalistic, it's emotional and empathetic. I am miserable. Let me spend three quatrains telling you how sad I am. And then magically, through this reversal, I think of you and everything's better, like a big object being whipped around by its small end. That's what I think Pedro de Mendez and the generosity of Thomas More, the character, represent. So we're at the top of the hour. I hope you find this interesting. As we move to later in the series and into the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, I think you'll find the books even more companionable. I hope that's the case. Utopia is a hard read. Gulliver's Travels isn't easy. I think the reading gets easier. We go back a step with King Lear, but it's worth going back for King Lear. So thank you, Michael, for everything, and all of you for your attending and attendance. And I'll see you next week, everyone.
That's great. Well, thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. And thank you, everybody, for attending. I just want to mention that Mark did do Literature and Life with us. And it was one of the first Zoom only programs we did in that memorable period when the virus hit everybody. And you can watch it on the library's YouTube
Oh
channel.
my goodness, I'm famous.
If you want the link to it, just send me an email. I'll send you the link to it. Yep,
You
that
can
was
come
from.
to my home and I'll perform it in my driveway.
And so we'll see all of you next week with Erewhon.
Right. Thank you all. Have a good night. Stay
Good night,
well.
everybody.